past. We've done a lot of background information about it. So we're finally going to get started with it. Now, you'll notice if you open up to the title page of the book where it says The Crucible, right beyond that, before we even begin about the historical, a little bit about the background information, but also the fact that this play is an allegory and that it represents not just a story about witches, but what was going on in America in the 1950s. He doesn't mention all of that here, but he does talk about the fact that for this play, he's taken real historical figures and he's adapted them to tell a coherent story. Because, you know, history doesn't have a neat beginning, middle, and end. There's no plot diagram that we can put on it. See that, unlike some other plays that you might have read, there are large passages of this that really are intended to be read. If you went to watch this on stage, there's a lot of background information that would not be given to you as an audience member. So we can think of this as being written for us, the readers, or possibly if we were going to produce a stage adaptation ourselves, this background information would inform us. If I were the director, this would help me think about what was going on and maybe give me that background information so I don't have to do all that research myself. So before we even get to the first line of the play, there's a significant amount to read. And so ahead, I'm going to read through the historical note. The words in italics are stage directions. I'll read those stage directions. I won't read it throughout the entire play, but just so we don't lose our place, I'll do that now. And then I'm also going to read this text which gives back. All I need you to do right now is follow along. The video will end when I get to the beginning of the dialogue of the play. Alright, so open up to, it's technically page 2, but it's where it says, a note on the historical accuracy of this play. I'm a papa. That's mine. Alright, a note on the historical accuracy of this play. This play is not history in the sense in which the word is used by the academic historian. Dramatic purposes have sometimes required many characters to be fused into one. The number of girls involved in the crying out has been reduced. Abigail's age has been raised. While there were several judges of almost equal authority, I have symbolized them all in Hathorne and Danforth. However, I believe that the reader will discover here the essential nature of one of the strangest and most awful chapters in human history. The fate of each character is exactly that of his historical model, and there is no one in the drama who did not play a similar, and in some cases exactly the same, role in history. As for the characters of the persons, little is known about most of them, excepting what may be surmised from a few letters, the trial record, certain broadsides written at the time, and references to their conduct in sources of varying reliability. They may therefore be taken as creations of my own, drawn to the best of my ability in conformity with their known behavior, except as indicated in the commentary I have written for this text. So that was basically just a letter from the author, Arthur Miller, straight to us, the audience, alright? But now you can look over at Act 1. Again, the words in italics, those are stage directions, so they describe the setting and they describe the action of the actors on stage. And then beyond that, though, the part that is not in italics, that's information that if I were the director, maybe I would decide that I would want to incorporate that backstory. Maybe I would tell the actors to read through this to inform how they're going to behave and interact with the other characters. Act 1. In a small upper bedroom in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, Salem, Massachusetts, in the spring of the year 1692. There is a narrow window at the left. Through its leaded panes the morning sunlight streams. A candle still burns near the bed, which is at the right. A chest, a chair, and a small table are the other furnishings. At the back, a door opens on the landing of the stairway to the ground floor. The room gives off an air of clean spareness. The roof rafters are exposed, and the wood colors are raw and unmellowed. As the curtain rises, Reverend Parris is discovered kneeling beside the bed, evidently in prayer. His daughter, Betty Parris, age 10, is lying on the bed inert. At the time of these events, Parris was in his middle 40s. In history, he cut a villainous path, and there is very little good to be said for him. He believed he was being persecuted wherever he went, despite his best efforts to win people and God to his side. I'm sure you've all met somebody like that who feels like no matter what happens, everybody's against them, and no matter how people interact, it's never this person's fault, it's always that people are against them, right? Well, that's how he feels he's being persecuted everywhere he goes in his life. In meeting, he felt insulted if somebody rose to shut the door without first asking his permission. Now here in meeting, it basically means in church, during a church service. He was a widower with no interest in children or talent with them. He regarded them as young adults, and until this strange crisis, he, like the rest of Salem, never conceived that the children were anything but thankful for being permitted to walk straight, eyes slightly lowered, arms at the sides, and mouths shut until bidden to speak. His house stood in the town, but we today would hardly call it a village. The meeting house was nearby, and from this point outward, toward the bay or inland, there were a few small windowed dark houses snuggling against the raw Massachusetts winter. Salem had been established hardly 40 years before. To the European world, the whole province was a barbaric frontier inhabited by a sect of fanatics, who nevertheless were shipping out products of slowly increasing quantity and value. No one can really know what their lives were like. They had no novelists, and would not have permitted anyone to read a novel if one were handy. Their creed or belief forbade anything resembling a theater or vain enjoyment. They did not celebrate Christmas, and a holiday from work meant only that they must concentrate even more upon prayer. Which is not to say that nothing broke into this strict and somber way of life. When a new farmhouse was built, friends assembled to raise the roof. And there would be special foods cooked and probably some potent cider passed around. Now, raise the roof does not mean they, laid down the funk. It means that they celebrated as they were building the barn. All right. There was a good supply of ne'er-do-wells in Salem who dallied at the shuffleboard in Bridget Bishop's tavern. Probably more than the creed, hard work kept the morals of the place from spoiling, for the people were forced to fight the land like heroes for every grain of corn, and no man had very much time for fooling around. That there were some jokers, however, is indicated by the practice of appointing a two-man patrol, whose duty was to walk forth in the time of God's worship, to take notice of such as either lie about the meeting house without attending to the word and ordinances, or that lie at home or in fields without giving good account thereof, and to take the names of such persons, and to present them to the magistrates, whereby they may be accordingly proceeded against. In other words, the police force that they had was really just in place to go around when church was in service and to write down the names of people who didn't go to church. All right, this was a theocracy. It was a religion-based society. This predilection for minding other people's business was time-honored among the people of Salem, and it undoubtedly created many of the suspicions which were to feed the coming madness. It was also, in my opinion, one of the things that a John Proctor, or a man like John Proctor, would rebel against. For the time of the armed camp had almost passed, and since the country was reasonably, although not wholly, safe, the old disciplines were beginning to rankle. But, as in all such matters, the issue was not clear-cut, for danger was still a possibility, and in unity still lay the best promise of safety. The edge of the wilderness was close by. The American continent stretched endlessly west, and it was full of mystery for them. It stood dark and threatening over their shoulders night and day, for out of it Indian tribes marauded from time to time, and Reverend Paris had parishioners who had lost relatives to these heathens. The parochial snobbery of these people was partly responsible for their failure to convert the Indians. Probably, they also preferred to take land from heathens rather than from fellow Christians. So, in other words, if they made the Indians Christians, they wouldn't feel justified in taking their land from them. At any rate, very few Indians were converted, and the Salem folk believed that the virgin forest was the devil's last preserve, his home base, and the citadel of his final stand. To the best of their knowledge, the American forest was the last place on earth that was not paying homage to God. For these reasons, among others, they carried about an air of innate resistance, even of persecution. Their fathers had, of course, been persecuted in England, so now they and their church found it necessary to deny any other sect its freedom, lest their new Jerusalem be defiled and corrupted by wrong ways and deceitful ideas. So again, in other words, this was a society based on religion and only one religion. They were not welcoming to other people who said, "Oh, I'm Christian too." They were very strong about shutting out those other faiths. They believed, in short, that they held in their steady hands the candle that would light the world. We have inherited this belief, and it has helped and hurt us. It helped them with the discipline it gave them. They were a dedicated folk, by and large, and they had to be, to survive the life they had chosen or been born into in this country. The proof of their belief's value to them may be taken from the opposite character of the first Jamestown settlement farther south in Virginia. So remember, Salem is in Massachusetts, but we're going to make a comparison with another early colony, Jamestown in Virginia. The Englishmen who landed there were motivated mainly by a hunt for profit. They had thought to pick off the wealth of the new country and then return rich to England. They were a band of individualists, and a much more ingratiating group than the Massachusetts men. But Virginia destroyed them. Massachusetts tried to kill off the Puritans, but they combined. They set up a communal society. Goodbye, darling. My wife's going to work now. My baby's sleeping, so hopefully he stays sleeping till I'm done. Where was I? But Virginia destroyed them. Massachusetts tried to kill off the Puritans, but they combined. They set up a communal society which, in the beginning, was little more than an armed camp with an autocratic and very devoted leadership. It was, however, an autocracy by consent, for they were united from top to bottom by a commonly held ideology whose perpetuation was the reason and justification for all their sufferings. So their self-denial, their purposefulness, their suspicion of all vain pursuits, their hard-handed justice were altogether perfect instruments for the conquest of this space so antagonistic to man. But the people of Salem in 1692 were not quite the dedicated folk that arrived on the Mayflower. A vast differentiation had taken place, and in their own time a revolution had unseated the royal government and subjected a junta, which was at this moment in power. A junta is like a coup, almost like a takeover. The times, to their eyes, must have been out of joint, and to the common folk must have seemed as insoluble and complicated as do ours today. I had a phone call. It is not hard to see how easily many could have been led to believe that the time of confusion had been brought upon them by deep and darkling forces. No hint of such speculation appears on the court record, but social disorder in any age breeds such mystical suspicions, and when, as in Salem, wonders are brought forth from below the social surface, it is too much to expect people to hold back very long from laying on the victims with all the force of their frustration. In other words, when things start to go sideways in any society at any time, the vulnerable people in that society are the ones who take the blame. Think of the term scapegoat, which you have heard before. The Salem tragedy, which is about to begin in these pages, so he's saying we're getting to the point here, we're about to start talking about the witch hunts, developed from a paradox. Now, do you guys know what a paradox is? I'm going to stop here for a minute. We're going to talk about what a paradox is. So, Mr. DeCarlos, pause. Okay. It is a paradox in whose grip we still live, and there is no prospect yet that we will discover its resolution. Simply it was this. For good purposes, even high purposes, the people of Salem developed a theocracy, a combine of state and religious power, whose function was to keep the community together, and to prevent any kind of disunity that might open it to destruction by material or ideological enemies. It was forged for a necessary purpose, and accomplished that purpose. But all organization is and must be grounded on the idea of exclusion and prohibition, just as two objects cannot occupy the same space. Evidently, the time came in New England when the repressions of order were heavier than seemed warranted by the dangers against which the order was organized. The witch hunt was a perverse manifestation of the panic which set in among all classes when the balance began to turn toward greater individual freedom. When one rises above the individual villainy displayed, one can only pity them all, just as we shall be pitied someday, It is still impossible for man to organize his social life without repression, and the balance has yet to be struck between order and freedom. The witch hunt was not, however, a mere repression. It was also, and as importantly, a long overdue opportunity for everyone so inclined to express publicly his guilt and sins, under the cover of accusations against the victims. It suddenly became possible, and patriotic, and holy, for a man to say that Martha Corey had come into his bedroom at night, and that while his wife was sleeping at his side, Martha laid herself down on his chest and nearly suffocated him. Of course, it was her spirit only, but his satisfaction at confessing himself was no lighter than if it had been Martha herself. One could not ordinarily speak such things in public. Long-held hatreds of neighbors could now be openly expressed, and vengeance taken, despite the Bible's charitable injunctions. So the Bible says, don't get revenge on people you hate, forgive them, right? Well, now there was a way, there was a reason to get revenge, right? To get vengeance. Land lust, which had been expressed by constant bickering over boundaries and deeds, could now be elevated to the arena of morality. One could cry witch against one's neighbor and feel perfectly justified in the bargain. Old scores could be settled on a plane of heavenly combat between Lucifer and the Lord. Suspicions and the envy of the miserable toward the happy could and did burst out in the general revenge. So now we're back to a few more stage directions. I'll finish that up, and then we would start with our speaking parts, with the dialogue. So Reverend Parris is praying now, and though we cannot hear his words, a sense of his confusion hangs about him. He mumbles, then seems about to weep, then he weeps, then prays again. But his daughter does not stir on the bed. The door opens and his Negro slave enters. Tituba is in her 40s. Paris brought her with him from Barbados, where she spent some years as a merchant before entering the ministry. She enters as one who can no longer bear. Am I reading this right or wrong? She enters as one does, who can no longer bear to be barred from the sight of her beloved. But she is also very frightened, because her slave sense has warned her that, as always, trouble in this house eventually lands on her back. And so now we're up to page 8. And throughout this whole play, but especially in Act 1, there are a few other passages that are long reading passages like that, but mostly now we're into the part where we've got our dialogue. Remember, as we're reading, we do not read out loud the parts in italics. Those are instructions for how the actor should speak or act, right? Great job. Let's see how much time we have left in class if we can begin reading today.